So today on Time for Anything, we are here with the usual trio, Derek, James, and Phil, and we are talking about suffering.
I am in eternal pain. Well, I feel like the first step to understanding what suffering is realizing that suffering really has no definition. I mean, it does, but suffering in general is subjective to the sufferer. Meaning the suffering of a healthy individual who may be affluent or has other privileges is not comparative to the suffering of someone who, for example, would be impoverished. They're non-comparable, different kinds of suffering, but nonetheless, we all suffer at the end of the day. But can one form of suffering be, quote, harsher than another?
Yes.
100%.
Yes.
Now,
go ahead.
No, yeah, I think at the end of the day, suffering is something we all go through, but there are people who suffer from things that maybe are out of their control. But I think the most important aspect is you have to accept that sufferance. You have to acknowledge that it exists and that you may be able to make a difference and reduce that suffering.
And also grow from that suffering. For example, you dealt with suffering with the fact that your father dealt with his issues and wasn't necessarily around in certain ways, and James, you dealt with suffering for just a simple example in the sense that the accident your father had in which he had health issues for a while, and I lost my father when I was 10. So even something like that those are bigger things that are considered suffering. But I think of little things such as, this sounds so first world problem, but I have to do my laundry and I got to pay the car insurance, or I have to wake up to go to my job. It's all of those things are little things that we suffer through in a way because we don't want to do them. So that's where I like that Buddhist mindset of life is suffering, because once you acknowledge that a lot of the things that either happen to you or the lot of things that you do are suffering, you can then acknowledge that and understand that this is just part of life, and therefore there's no reason in getting hung up on simple things such as doing the laundry or going to work, because they're, in a certain light, a necessity, depending on your circumstance.
Right. I think it's important still to delineate between the suffering of something like doing the laundry, which is suffering in a sense, versus malnourishment, mass poverty, child endangerment, things that are out of your control, but nonetheless you suffer from or are afflicted by.
Right.
There is a scale.
There is certainly a scale.
It's difficult because, like you said before, suffering is subjective. So it's difficult to pinpoint, well, my suffering is worse than somebody else's. And you probably shouldn't even try to think that way.
Right.
That,
it's not
that
a
can
competition.
cause more pain. And, right, it's not a competition.
So I guess the question is, if we're all in agreement that we all suffer, then how do I end my suffering, and how do I help others end their suffering?
I'll bring this back like I've done a million times, because this is one of my favorite books I've ever read, is Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, It's All Small Stuff. I can't even imagine how many times I've talked about this or referenced this.
You have a lot.
But I just love it.
But it's important.
It's so good. It's an amazing book, and it helps you get through that daily suffering. It helps you understand that you're going to have little things that happen, but you know what? In the grand scheme of things, generally speaking, it's all small stuff. For example, my dad's death wasn't really a small thing, but it kind of was in the sense where I'm still moving, and I have days or weeks or months where I don't even think about the fact that I don't have a father anymore. It's just become such commonplace that I've grown past it. I've gotten over the obstacle of that suffering. So I would say one way to quote unquote end suffering is accept suffering.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm at with my personal experience with suffering. I don't mind sharing it because I've made it such a part of my life at this point. My father has suffered from addiction all my life, and it has affected me in many ways. I just found out some other news that I don't feel comfortable sharing to the public that sort of adds on to that suffering. But the addition of the news that I found out didn't really hit me like it should, quote, should have.
Quote, should have, yeah.
Right, because I've overcome the feelings that the suffering had brought me many years ago, and I've lived every day with that suffering to the point where I've accepted it. So the news that I received didn't really affect me in a negative way, but it's still distressful, but you learn to manage and deal with that. And there are a lot of ways to deal with suffering. I think Buddhism definitely stands out for me personally as the most direct example of ways that you can deal with suffering. But James, why don't you go into that a little more?
Yeah, I know that you probably have a lot to say on that.
Buddhism?
Well, just suffering in general, but like suffering maybe related to Buddhism. But anyway, just go ahead.
What you both were saying, I found connections to Stoicism actually.
Okay.
With the acceptance of suffering. I think that's something that Stoicism does a good job at helping you realize that you just have to accept it. I think it can be dangerous, Stoicism as a philosophy, because it, in a sense, dulls down your emotions, maybe reactions to things. Right, if somebody's completely stoic, right, if somebody's completely stoic, they seem almost robotic. But once you start to understand, well, I can't control the traffic, so I shouldn't get too upset that I'm stuck in traffic right now. Or even something to the degree of my dad died, it's that knee-jerk reaction is always going to be there. It's then understanding how to deal with it. And I think that's something that both Stoicism, Buddhism, that these philosophies can help us with. Maybe Buddhism's a little bit better at incorporating your emotions, whereas Stoicism maybe for a lot of people they'll kind of shut out their emotions, and rather than accepting and growing from it, they just say, well, I can't change it, I just don't let it affect me. I think suffering should still affect you to a degree, because that's how you can overcome and grow from the experience.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
I see Stoicism as kind of being the bad cop and the good cop, bad cop. I guess you could say the good cop. Stoicism's like, get over it. Smack on the butt, get going. But with Buddhism, you first have to accept that we all suffer. And the reason why we suffer is because of our attachment to materialistic, emotive things in our world. Then, once you accept those two things, you uncover the truth that you can end your suffering, and then, to top it all off, Buddhism provides you with a path that leads to the end of the suffering.
Correct.
So it's not leaving you, quote, like hanging out to dry with suffering. It's like, let's figure it out. It's like, no, there is a way to end it, and if you want to do that, do this.
Yes.
So in Buddhism, they talk about the middle way, which is the existence of a middle ground between the two extremes of debauchery and purity, in a sense, where it's essentially moderation. It's life without social indulgences, but also without depriving yourself of those indulgences. It's balance, moderation, whatever you want to call it. The same theme pops up outside of Buddhism. It pops up in addiction counseling. The idea of, well, actually, no. It depends on the counseling you're getting, but...
That's very true. And even just, like, my personal beliefs. Like, the idea that you can't shut yourself off from everything and say that you're not gonna enjoy or indulge at all. Because to me, that, in my mind, personally, and again, everyone's different, To me, I just think that doesn't really solve anything. You're just kind of, and not that it doesn't solve anything because it totally depends on your situation, but I think more of this idea where you don't want to be the person who's doing drugs and drinking alcohol every day, but you might want to be the person who enjoys a drink once or twice a week, and I think it's okay to take that idea, that middle way, that path where you're not shutting yourself out of everything, but you're also not overindulging of everything. You're finding this responsible middle ground because if anything, that's what you have to do with everything in your life. If you have a family, you can't be all work and no family, but you can't be all family and no work.
Mm-hmm.
You have to find the middle way.
I think it's also important to note that even in the middle way, there is still suffering.
Correct.
When
Of
you're,
course.
with your family for the weekend, maybe your work does suffer a little bit because that's just what happens. And maybe if you go into work that weekend, your family suffers or you're suffering from missing your family or
Correct.
missing out on your kid's baseball game. So
it's a lose-lose, but it's also a win-win.
right. No, the balance is important.
Correct.
Because even if you make 4 out of 6 of the baseball games, at least you were there for 4 out of 6 of them rather than being at work for all of them.
Correct.
I think it's a big jump to go cold turkey on indulgences. I think, especially if you're looking for a relief from your suffering and you're overindulging to a great capacity, it's pretty unrealistic to say, okay, just cut at all of your indulgences out. Because we are still very much human, and you have to consider that Buddhism is an ancient religion where they didn't have any concept of the technologies that we have today and the sheer amount of influence that society has on the individual.
Yeah.
This is a time where villages were commonplace. Small clusters of humanity existed across Eurasia and the world. And it's just a different way of living compared to 2020, where if I go on my phone on any app, I'm most likely going to be influenced in some way.
Yeah. It's very true.
So you have to be realistic. But then there's also some people react positively to the slap in the butt method, which is what we talked about with Stoicism.
Yeah.
And of course, with anything, you're not just going to wake up one day and say, I'm done. Or maybe you do, but it's very hard.
I've kind of always imagined Stoicism in the sense where it is jumping to the acceptance phase in the 5 stages of grief. Where, right? So it's almost like just getting to that end step and being like, this is what is happening, just accept it. And it's not that you can skip over the other steps, but Stoicism in my mind is almost a means to getting to the acceptance phase quicker. I've used this example before. I've expressed this to you guys several times, but when I lost my job during COVID, I, on my way to drop off my stuff, just had to think for a second and almost jump to the acceptance phase of, this is reality, this is what's happening, I can't change this, I have to accept this. And having that mindset helped me so much because it helped me not freak out and not stress and not go ballistic and freak out and have a panic attack. It was more of just this idea of, this is what is and it will be and I have to accept this.
Do you think if you take the middle way, suffering would ever end?
No.
Do you think it's possible to end suffering completely?
No.
I kind of disagree. I think if you live a monastic lifestyle, you could end your individual suffering. But again, that's more so dependent on the perspective of the sufferer. Because to us, we say, oh, monks are suffering because they're missing out on the totality of human existence, and they're not truly living a full life because they're dedicating their life to one thing. But to them, they probably end their suffering because they have relinquished all earthly attachments and now live a monastic lifestyle. So I would say monks probably get the closest to ending their suffering, but at the
Yes.
end of the day, you are a human. You need water, you need food, you
Yes.
need shelter, you need
Exactly.
clothes, and without those things, you are in fact suffering.
Right, because okay, so yes, I agree with your point that Buddhist monks, for sake of example, are probably very close to ending their suffering, or the closest you can get to ending their suffering, for sake of conversation. To elaborate on that, I think that people in general can't necessarily end their suffering altogether because you still have things that you suffer from. For example, you could have a Buddhist monk who is very at peace with things, but unfortunately he got some type of food poisoning or some type of disease, and now he is struggling with a bowel disorder and is having issues going to the bathroom. So no matter what you do, you're still going to have painful experiences.
Yeah, but I think it's still subjective to the point that even though that monk may have bowel issues, he might not suffer from them, but is rather just inconvenienced by, or I
But
think
if you're
it's I think
experiencing
it's
pain or discomfort.
yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're suffering. I think suffering is more subjective than that. Just because I'm in pain doesn't mean I'm suffering. People that enjoy BDSM or
Right.
being
Yeah, I see your
hurt
point.
during sex are still they're enjoying that. They're not suffering at that point. It's the opposite.
Yeah, I can see where you're going with that.
So because, just for the example of pain, because pain can both cause suffering and happiness or joy, I think that there's still that middle path that pain causes nothing for you. It hurts, sure, and it causes discomfort, but you're not necessarily suffering from it, and you're also not enjoying it.
This is totally vague, and I have no significant data to back this up, but I feel like I read somewhere that the part of your brain that processes suffering and pleasure are very closely connected.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that.
I think some people just don't process pain the way others do, and that it triggers a
Yeah.
pleasure response versus a painful response.
Shout out to Aeroplane by Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Yeah, of course. And there's this guy, Friedrich Nietzsche, who is both brilliant and insane. He's insanely brilliant
That's funny.
because he takes suffering to such a degree. And this guy suffered in life. He died very tragically. He
I don't even
like
think I'm familiar with how he
supposedly
died.
he supposedly died of heartbreak because he saw someone run over an animal in public and was so frustrated with mankind that just died of poor health. He
I
lived
believe it.
pretty much as a hermit. Did he really wish suffering upon his closest friends and family?
Yeah, he believed that suffering was the only thing that could help you grow as a person, as an individual.
I can relate to that.
He wished suffering upon everyone, especially his closest friends and family.
It's tricky because it's very easy to attribute the word suffering to something negative.
Right.
But
Right.
working out is suffering.
Yes.
And there is such a thing as eustress versus distress. And
Mm-hmm.
my biology teacher in high school has just ingrained this concept in my brain that distress elicits a different reaction from your body versus eustress.
Correct.
Initially, it's the same, but the overall result becomes different. And I
Right.
think that is where that growth lies. And I think Nietzsche is so brilliant that he almost seems insane because you're not like, you got to dig the deepest for him. And I actually, one of my favorite, actually it's my favorite quote of all time. Like, I want this quote tattooed on my body. That your dying be not a reproach to man and earth. My friends, I solicit the honey of your soul. He wrote that in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Essentially, it means live your life to the fullest, suffer, cry, be happy, experience all that humanity has to offer,
Yeah, man.
so that I can see the honey of your soul, the
Yeah.
growth of your soul, the sweetest part of your soul.
Yeah. I was driving back from getting groceries with Gabe and John the other day before we did that podcast, and like windows are down, we're driving, it's loud, and I look over at John and I'm yelling. I'm like, isn't it great to be human? We can think and feel and hurt and love and listen to music and enjoy food and essentially, yeah, I was just expressing to him that we have the ability to experience joy but also suffering. And that is amazing. The fact that we're allowed to get to our highest highs where we feel so euphoric and we're experiencing something like love, for example, that's just this bliss and you're entranced in a way in whatever circumstance. But then you can also have these times where you just feel so low and shut down. And that's just beautiful to me.
I just wanted to circle back to something that you were saying before. I think you had just mentioned exercise is suffering. And I think there's a difference between suffering that comes from an external source that you can't control and suffering that you've caused for yourself.
Distress and eustress. Yeah.
And the suffering that you cause for yourself, like exercise, could also relate to anxiety and overthinking things.
Yes.
And that's
Correct,
that
yeah.
relates directly to Stoicism. Something that Stoicism says, if you just don't worry, then you won't suffer. But I don't think that cut and dry.
Right.
I think sometimes
Yeah.
you worry about something that you can't help but worry.
I'm glad you had mentioned that because I saw a post on Reddit, Ask Reddit, r/Ask Reddit. It was talking to psychologists, like what's the one patient that made you judge them? And the one comment, most of the comments from actual professionals are like that judgment is not a part of our job. Of course, we are human and we have reactions, but it's important for us to put aside those reactions to perform our job effectively and actually get the help that these people need.
Yeah.
But the one comment pointed out that we as a society, particularly U.S. society, went from completely stuffing mental illness into the recesses of our mind to now relishing in the idea that we suffer and that it's okay to basically remain stagnant because you suffer from mental illness.
Yep.
And I totally agree with that. I think and this is probably an unpopular opinion as it stands, but I know a lot of people that relish in their mental illness. And it's sad to me because they are great, wholesome, and pure people, but they have found an out to say, don't blame me, I have this. Don't blame me, I have that.
I definitely did that for a little while when...
Yeah, I do it too.
Yeah.
I've done it for 5 years.
And that's the thing. And, I mean, you were diagnosed with, what is it, like, I forget what it's called, situational depression? What was it called?
Yeah, it's acute depression.
Acute depression.
Yeah.
So it's like there could be trigger things, such as something that's been really stressful or difficult for you to deal with, and then you might slip into a depressive state for a short period of time. And I had anxious tendencies and depressive tendencies, but I never wanted to admit to myself entirely. I mean, sure I did for a period, but this idea where I didn't want to tell myself that that's what was wrong with me because I didn't want to let that part of things take over me. And then again, I was never diagnosed, so who's to say if I ever actually had anxiety or depression or whatever?
I think we all do. I think it's a natural human response to have anxiety about things because if you didn't, you would die.
Yeah, but
just going back to your point, I think at least Nietzsche would say if those people, instead of just relishing in it were to get over it and grow from it, they would end their suffering and become better people for it. They would
Yeah,
get
instead
over
of
this
just
obstacle.
curling up in a ball and
Mhm.
accepting it. Which,
Yeah.
again, I'm not blanket statementing. I'm not saying that's what everyone
And
with a
it's
disorder
different.
does.
And we're not victim blaming
No,
either,
no.
because people legitimately do suffer with chemical
Yes,
imbalances
that is
in
so
their
true.
brain that they have no power over, and it goes back to the concepts of poverty and malnourishment. These people suffer from things that they can't control. To an extent, I think psychotropic drugs can assist, but that will not be the ultimate answer
Oh,
to the suffering.
Didn't you say that you were on a medication for a while that the way you explained this was so powerful? You said it felt like you were tied in the fetal position with your hands behind your head, but that's how you felt in your mind when you were on that medication.
Mm-hmm.
Like you were almost locked into a state and you couldn't break free, and it was almost as if the medication was forcing you to be a certain way, and it actually was tying you down rather than freeing you. It was suppressing your ability to overcome your disorder instead of enabling your ability to overcome your disorder.
Right.
And again, that's not for all people. That's
it's
not for all
people.
medications.
Of course.
But for your
definitely-
particular experience, that's how it was.
Yeah, it was Lexapro 10 milligrams, which is comparatively to other drugs a very mild dose of an MMOI. And it did feel that way. It felt like I didn't feel sad, and I never really felt super depressed, but I never felt super happy. It was like I could feel elated for a couple seconds, but the feeling would subside and I'd be regulated and right back to my equilibrium,
Yep.
which is great. But I think it's also great to feel sadness and to cry. And sometimes I just want to cry, but I can't. And I don't know what that is,
No, I
because
totally
like
understand that.
you just want to cry, but you
Yep.
can't. And crying is another. I hate talking about crying all the time, but it is a great relief for suffering. It brings you back. It's that release from the sadness.
That leads me to a point. Can you have happiness, joy, and relief if you can't experience suffering? If you're on... let me take a step back. This is directly related, I guess, to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. The drug Soma is meant to cause eternal happiness, I guess, in
I
people.
get what you mean.
And just at the time that I had read the book, I was also reading about like what do people think about utopias. And utopia is to remove all pain and suffering, right? But if you don't have pain and suffering, can you feel happiness and joy? And
Dude, I cannot remember the guy's name, but there was someone who had the philosophy of we live in the most perfect of all worlds
the
because
best of all, yeah.
because we're able to experience suffering. I believe that, and I can't remember if this was, shout out to Stephen West, I can't remember if this is him who said it or if he was quoting the philosopher, the idea that if you would never grow thirsty, you would never appreciate drinking a glass of water.
Right.
And it's sort of this, yeah, I see exactly what you're saying. This idea that were you to never experience hardship or, for the sake of the episode, suffering, would you ever truly appreciate the things that are anti-suffering or gratifying? But then I almost wonder if, isn't that the entire point of heaven or nirvana, is the sense where you're accessing a space in which it is pure bliss, pure happiness, pure enjoyment, no suffering?
I wouldn't even really want that. I would just want something pure. If I had my way in the afterlife, it would be everything and nothing. Limitless possibilities with no consequence or detriment. A lot like a dream where you can experience a great dream or a nightmare, but at the end of the day, you wake up and everything's fine. But I believe that most things exist in dichotomy, meaning you're exactly right. if you were never thirsty, or
You'd never
what was that?
You'd never appreciate that glass of water. If you were
Exactly.
thirsty, right.
With the example of heaven, if it is just eternal bliss, well, then that's no longer bliss, that's just your baseline.
Well,
Exactly.
But now I do see what you're saying. But if you could somehow have, hypothetically, a realm in which that happiness was always that way. So it is this almost, in a sense, magical place in which you are always experiencing
I
the
just
happiness
think
and
that
bliss.
if you're always experiencing happiness and bliss, you're not actually experiencing happiness and bliss.
And-
you won't feel that way
Right.
anymore.
And I
it
see
just
your
becomes
point.
your bottom line.
But you're no longer human, you are spirit, and you're not limited to the human tendencies of things
Which,
becoming normal.
Once that happens, I feel like that doesn't relate to what we're talking
Sure,
about.
right.
I think
because
it's sort of
based on the human experience.
Right.
like
Correct.
a prerequisite to experiencing pure bliss in heaven is that you have memories of your suffering on earth.
You know what suffering
You
Yeah.
know what
feels
suffering
correct.
is, but if you don't know what suffering is, you don't know what bliss is.
Now, shout out to Duncan Trussell. Also, shout out to the Midnight Gospel. I can't remember if he was saying that this is what he believes or if this is what he was saying is a possibility, is that you are a god, essentially, that decided it wanted to experience suffering and what it is like to be human, and therefore that is why you are here. So that's just an interesting thing that I think about is what if there's a possible realm in which there is no suffering and we can't even comprehend what lack of suffering and pure enjoyment is. Because we are human, we think that it is impossible to experience a realm in which you are no longer suffering. So that is why we wanted to come here, was to experience suffering. That's just one thing, but regardless, either way, we are here to experience suffering. No matter why we're here, even if we are here by pure math and statistics, and it is the Big Bang, and it is a nihilistic point of view, and it all means nothing, or there is something beyond. Either way, we are experiencing suffering here right now, and one of the things that is incredibly beneficial, again, regardless of why you're here, is learning to mediate and understand your suffering and grow with it instead of letting it control you.
I think also the implementation of time is a requirement for suffering because we are all aware of the fact that eventually we will die. So it's this race to getting towards enlightenment, towards an end to suffering, because we have a finite amount of time.
Correct.
But if we were immortal and
Didn't experience time.
didn't experience time, we wouldn't know the difference between suffering or happiness. It would just be existence.
I would borderline disagree, but I do see your point in which it would all just become one. But I still think you could experience suffering. I just don't think that it would be so cut and dry and almost packaged in the way that we do as humans. Because
Well, it wouldn't be on a timeline.
Right.
Correct.
It wouldn't be
Right.
yesterday I was suffering and today I am happy.
Right,
It would just be I'm suffering and I'm happy.
right. Yeah, it's kind of this
Exactly.
amalgamation, this weird mixture of it all happening at
Something
at
that
the same
we
time.
can't even conceive
Right.
because
Exactly,
all
like
we
you-
know is
Is
time.
Yeah.
Right. If we flipped the script and we knew that we were immortal versus knowing that we would eventually die, concepts like suffering could exist. Like you could still feel pain and you could still suffer, but it doesn't matter when it ends because nothing will ever end.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, based on a utilitarian point of view, the whole idea is to end or reduce the total amount of suffering. This is sort of what Rohan was saying in the episode we recorded with him. He was thinking if you look at things purely in a utilitarian point of view, you would want people to have the best genetics, the best human lives that they're given, people be genetically modified to be incredibly smart, incredibly adept, able to learn things and not experience suffering at such a greater scale. But either way, I still think as humans, you experience suffering either way, It's just a matter of how you handle and interpret that suffering, in my mind.
Exactly.
I have a point that we can cut out because it's kind of weird. But from a utilitarian point of view, abortion should be okay if the fetus has a disorder.
Yes.
Yeah.
I
So,
don't think that matters.
well, I'm kind of interested in talking about this point because I remember asking you about this a couple months ago when it was Mike and John and you and me in the kitchen. And I said to you, well, don't you almost have to have dystopia for a utopia? In the sense where you have to have the negative parts of it for the good parts, because exactly like we were saying, you almost have to have the suffering to have the parts of it that are bliss.
I don't think that you need a dystopia fully, because dystopia is a very specific thing. It means that everything is going wrong. If a utopia is defined as an ideally perfect place, etc., then a dystopia would be the direct opposite.
So maybe the
right?
wrong way to phrase that is
But-
you need dystopia and utopia. Maybe I should say, like Nietzsche says, you have to have, in a way, suffering within your utopia for it to be a utopia.
Maybe.
But
because
then you
I
almost
also
contradict
think
the whole point of utopia.
yeah, I also think utopia could mean not ever feeling suffering, but
Right.
you don't necessarily need happiness in a utopia. If you're just neutral the entire time, that could still be considered a utopia.
I kind of see your point.
I
because
see
it's not
utopia as
dystopia.
more of
Right.
a neutral ground because like I said, I don't think you would really understand happiness if you never suffered. It's like Wall-E.
The problem I have with that point of view, though, is simply that we are thinking of all of this from a human perspective. And
Because we're human.
Well,
Because
that's
we're
the only
human,
way we
so-
can think of it.
right, but to say that you can never experience pure happiness or bliss without suffering is almost just wrong, because there could hypothetically be a reality in which that is possible, but it is beyond our understanding and comprehension.
Sure, it's possible, but because it's beyond our comprehension, then it doesn't really matter for us.
I guess I see your point.
Then it's okay to say you can't have happiness without suffering because
Because
we're
we know we are experiencing
humans,
through humans,
right.
right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what if, okay, we recognize the fact that we are humans and we are constrained to our human mind and consciousness. Do animals register that they're suffering, or do they only know stimulus response in the sense that this made me feel bad, so I'm going to avoid this?
Okay, so here's where I get into a weird thing with my understanding of consciousness and animals and suffering, and we can go a lot more into this
Right.
at another point.
Yeah, and I
But-
think we will.
I do think, yeah, we actually are planning on doing an episode on that.
Yeah, the third, I think.
I still do think that experiencing things through a non-human perspective, let me think about a way to explain this. So I think it's, and I've said this to you several times, as far as my belief goes, the consciousness is limited to the physical form in which it inhabits.
Right.
So I think that it's not that animals can't experience suffering, and not that that's necessarily what you're saying, but I think that it's not impossible for animals to experience suffering. If anything, I think that they all do. It's that they are limited to their physical form in the sense that they might not be able to comprehend their suffering. Example, think of a porcupine that gets attacked by a snake and it is now dying from poison.
Mm-hmm.
That porcupine isn't thinking about more beyond it in the sense where it doesn't know it's poisoned. It just knows
Right.
it got bit and now something bad is happening.
Yeah.
It's not thinking consciously, I am suffering, I am poisoned, I am not feeling, I'm dying. But it might think, I've been bitten, this hurts, I do not feel good, I feel really horrible right now, I am suffering. But again, it doesn't have language. It doesn't have English or any other language, so it can't.
We never really will understand.
It is more so thinking in emotion and feeling. Its brain is just working in this state in which it can't conjugate its thoughts. So it can feel that it is in pain and that it is suffering and that it is dying, but it does not understand the concept of suffering
As
and dying.
far as we know, because so you guys know I have a fear of dolphins.
Beluga whales are actually probably smarter. They think the smartest creature on Earth is...
What are they
beluga
called?
whales.
Cephalopods? What are they called? I believe it might be
I
cephalopods.
know. Aren't cephalopods or octopi?
Oh, they're smart too.
Oh, dude, they're so
they're
smart.
really smart.
They're really smart.
I just playing devil's advocate, flip the script. What if there are certain species of animals, such as dolphins, beluga whales, or octopi, that understand that they suffer,
Yeah.
recognize it, and accept it? Like
I can
they
believe it.
have transcended us.
I can totally understand that. In which you have, for example, there was some whale that got hit with a harpoon. I forget the entire context of it, but it was hit with a harpoon back in the 1880s or something, and then was killed in the 90s finally. And they realized that this thing it got hit, it survived, and was living with a harpoon inside of it for over 100 years. This thing definitely got hit, realized it got hit, was bleeding, was suffering, but at some point accepted and acknowledged it and healed and was probably thinking, I'm fine now. It's been a while. I've been hurt.
Yeah.
This thing is still in me and I can probably
This
feel it and it
probably
irritates me.
yeah.
But at least I'm not gone.
Mm-hmm.
At least my example is my dad. When he, had his accident with his hand, he still had pain afterward for a long time. They put you through pain management because that pain never goes away. Your nerves are always hurting, but you just eventually drown out that pain.
Correct.
It goes into the background.
Yeah.
And the same thing with pain tolerance. Talked
can
about
almost-
earlier in sex.
I don't mean to
with-
cut you off, but I apologize. I can almost draw your parallel with if you're experiencing bliss all the time, it becomes normal, just in the
Right,
sense where you're
exactly.
experiencing pain all the time,
Yes.
it becomes normal.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
my
it's-
shoulder, remember how my shoulder was hurt for like a month
Yeah.
or two?
Yeah, it's just
I did
it's become
nothing.
commonplace.
To fix it. And I probably should have done something.
Yeah.
Just get used to it.
Yeah.
But I understand your point, but continue. Sorry.
Well, I think that was my point.
Okay.
Sorry. Sorry to interject,
Yeah,
James.
No, that's fine.
But yeah, I don't know. I think either way, we experience suffering, and it is up to us to mediate our suffering and come to a state in which we can accept it and move forward.
Absolutely.
There's always an opportunity to move forward. You just have
And-
to legitimately want to move forward. You have to put your intent there.
And I think the biggest part about suffering is both moving forward from it and also growing from the experience. I think most anything that you suffer from can help you grow as a person.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It definitely can make you grow. It's important to recognize that we all suffer and that there can be an end to that suffering if you're willing to put in the work.
Correct.
And just one point about Stoicism, I think Stoicism is a very good avenue to get you to the acceptance part, but I don't think it does a great job with growing your
Yes.
individuality
I can
through
see that.
suffering. But, I mean, it can help you accept some of the hardest things in life.
Mm-hmm.
And the hardest things that you will go through, Stoicism and Buddhism and reading Nietzsche, and I'm sure there's a million other philosophies that we're leaving out that can help you regulate how you feel after, or regulate how you feel as a result of suffering,
Mm-hmm.
and also help you grow from the experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
I one of the first philosophical texts that I ever read was Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and I highly recommend to the audience
Absolutely.
picking up that book because one, easy read. It's all
Yeah.
basic. Basically, this guy had a notebook and he was just writing down thoughts. in his day-to-day life. They're like short. Sometimes they can be a little lengthy. Sometimes they're
Yeah,
2 to 3 sentences.
Yeah.
Just whatever this guy's thinking.
Yeah.
If even some of them are like a fragmented sentence, and you're just like,
Right.
cool, made sense. I like it.
And for context, this guy is a Roman emperor.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
he's
that's
got the good life.
One of the better Roman emperors,
Absolutely.
I'd argue.
Yeah.
'Cause there
Yeah.
were some pretty bad ones.
There,
So.
Nero.
That's the
Yeah,
first guy.
Nero.
to do it.
Yep, first guy
Yep.
playing his harp
Yeah.
while
Just
the city of
roll
Rome burned.
down.
Good job, Nero.
That's great.
Supposedly. It's all just stories. We don't actually know if he literally played the harp while the city burned, but
Well, yeah, I mean,
but
be-
that's
yeah.
it's a good generalization for how he was as an emperor. So
Yeah,
it's fine.
absolutely.
but hey,
So yeah,
timeforanything.com.
timeforanything.com.
Check us out on Reddit, on Discord,
Yeah, we have all the links to all our social media on our website.
Twitter,
and on
Instagram.
the Reddit. The Reddit has everything you need as well.
Everything should have everything else.
Yeah,
as far as I know.
yeah, pretty much.
Except for
And if it
maybe Spotify, but
Doesn't,
everything.
then we'll fix it.
Yep. So timeforanything.com. That's our hub.
r/time for anything.
Any final words, gentlemen?
Kiss, kiss. Have a good night.
Kiss, kiss. Have a good night.